Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The words cut through the evening air like broken glass. Don't expect a dime from my lottery winnings, Papa. Celeste stood in the doorway of their cramped apartment in Lyons Croix district, her lottery ticket clutched in her trembling hand. The numbers on the television screen behind her glowed like tiny daggers, numbers that matched exactly what she held. 47 million euros. Her father, Marcel, sat hunched over his wheelchair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The oxygen tank beside him hissed softly, the only sound in the suffocating silence that followed her declaration. Marcel's eyes, once bright with the hope that had sustained him through 3 years of dialysis treatments, now dulled like dying embers. The medical bills scattered across the coffee table seemed to mock him. Invoices from the hospital, overdue notices from the pharmacy, letters threatening eviction. His daughter's face, so much like her mother's, remained cold and distant. She had inherited Amelie's delicate features but none of her warmth. The small television flickered, showing footage of previous lottery winners celebrating, their joy a stark contrast to the devastation unfolding in this modest living room. Celeste, Marcel whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical breathing apparatus. Please, ma petite, I don't need much. Just enough for the treatments. The doctors say without the surgery. His words trailed off as she turned away, her designer heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. She had changed since starting her job at the law firm, trading her simple dresses for expensive suits, her gentle nature for sharp ambition. The lottery ticket crinkled in her grip as she moved toward the window, gazing out at the city lights that twinkled like distant stars. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as the weight of her words settled between them. Marcel remembered teaching her to count with those same numbers when she was 5, sitting on this very floor, her small fingers pointing at each digit with wonder. Now those numbers represented freedom. Her freedom from him, from his illness, from the burden she clearly saw him as. The radiator clanked and groaned, struggling to heat the drafty space they called home. Pictures of happier times lined the mantelpiece, but they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I've worked for everything I have, Celeste said finally, not turning around. Every exam I passed, every promotion I earned, every sacrifice I made. This lottery ticket. I bought it with my own money, from my own purse, with my own dreams. Her reflection in the window showed a woman transformed, her features hardened by determination and something else, something that looked disturbingly like contempt. The city below buzzed with late-evening activity, people heading home to families who would celebrate with them, share in their joy, make plans for a brighter future together. Marcel closed his eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his failing kidneys. In his mind, he could still see the little girl who used to climb onto his lap and promise to take care of him when he got old. That child seemed like a ghost now, replaced by this stranger who spoke of sacrifice while wearing a watch that cost more than his monthly medication. The lottery numbers burned into his memory: 7, 14, 23, 31, 42, and 49. Numbers that could save his life, held by the one person in the world he thought would want to save it. But as he watched his daughter's silhouette against the window, Marcel realized he might not know her at all anymore. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Celeste's fingers trembled as she folded the lottery ticket and slipped it into her purse, the sound of the zipper unnaturally loud in the heavy quiet. Marcel's labored breathing provided a rhythm to the moment, each wheeze a reminder of time running out. The winning numbers still flashed on the television screen: 7, 14, 23, 31, 42, and 49, as if the universe was mocking the cruel irony unfolding in this tiny apartment. Outside, a church bell tolled 9 times, each chime echoing through the narrow streets of Old Lyon like a countdown to something irreversible. "You don't understand what I've been through," Celeste continued, her voice gaining strength as she turned to face him. Her eyes, once soft like her mother's, now held the hardness of someone who had learned to protect herself at any cost. "While you were getting sicker, I was working 16-hour days. While you were resting, I was studying for the bar exam. While you were asking for help, I was building a life where I'd never have to ask anyone for anything." The words fell like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that would reach far beyond this moment. Marcel watched his daughter's face, searching for any trace of the child who used to bandage his scraped knees with cartoon band-aids, who would sing lullabies to him when nightmares woke him after Amélie died. The transformation felt impossible, like watching a flower bloom in reverse. Her success at the law firm had changed more than just her wardrobe. It had hardened something essential inside her. The apartment's dim lighting cast shadows across her features, making her look like a stranger wearing his daughter's face. "I know you sacrificed for me, Papa," she said, but her tone suggested the opposite, that his sacrifices had been burdens rather than gifts. "But that was your choice. You chose to work double shifts when I was young. You chose to spend your savings on my education. You chose to take care of me instead of yourself." She paused, her chest rising and falling with the effort of suppressing emotions she clearly didn't want to feel. "And now I'm choosing to take care of myself. For once in my life, I'm choosing me." The medical equipment surrounding Marcel's chair seemed to close in like a metal forest of tubes and wires. Each machine represented another monthly payment, another debt collector's call, another piece of his dignity sacrificed to the god of surviving another day. The lottery ticket in her purse might as well have been on the moon, so close to salvation, yet impossibly out of reach. He could see his reflection in the blank television screen now that the lottery broadcast had ended, a broken man in a broken chair, surrounded by the broken dreams he'd once had for his daughter. But something in Celeste's eyes flickered, just for a moment, and Marcel caught it. Beneath the armor of indifference, beneath the cold calculation of her words, he saw something that looked like fear. Not fear of poverty or failure, but something deeper. Fear of becoming him. Fear of sacrificing so much for someone else that nothing remained for herself. Fear of loving someone so completely that their needs became more important than her own survival. And in that flickering moment of recognition, Marcel realized this wasn't just about money or medical bills or lottery winnings. This was about a daughter who had watched her father give everything to everyone else until there was nothing left but an empty shell connected to machines, and she had sworn it would never happen to her. 2 years earlier, the same apartment had felt like a sanctuary. Celeste rushed through the door, still wearing her graduation cap from law school, her face glowing with achievement. Marcel had managed to attend the ceremony despite his worsening condition, sitting in the back row with his portable oxygen tank hidden beneath his best jacket. The pride in his eyes could have lit up the entire Croix-Rousse district. "We did it, Papa," she had laughed, spinning around in the small living room. "Your little girl is finally a lawyer." The walls seemed to sparkle with possibility then, every corner filled with dreams of a better future. Marcel remembered how she had helped him to bed that night, chattering excitedly about job prospects and the cases she wanted to handle. Her touch was gentle as she adjusted his pillows, her voice soft as she told him about the interviews she had lined up at Du Bois and Associates, one of Lyon's most prestigious firms. "They're offering good money, Papa. Enough to help with your treatments and maybe even get us a better place." She had kissed his forehead the way she used to when she was small, her lips warm against his fevered skin. The memory felt like it belonged to different people now. The change had been gradual at first. Celeste landed the job and threw herself into work with the intensity she had always brought to her studies. The late nights stretched longer, the weekend visits became brief check-ins, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her patience began to wear thin. Marcel's needs, the doctor appointments, the medication schedules, the emotional support he craved as his body failed him, started feeling like interruptions to her carefully structured life. The apartment that once felt like their shared refuge began to feel like a prison holding her back from the success she had worked so hard to achieve. "You're becoming just like them," Marcel had warned her one evening about 6 months into her new career. She had arrived home after midnight, exhausted and irritable, complaining about a difficult client who expected too much for too little money. "Like who?" she had snapped, not bothering to remove her coat before collapsing into the chair across from him. "Like the rich people who think everything is about money," he had replied quietly. The words had hit their target. Celeste's face had flushed with anger, and for the first time, Marcel saw something cold flicker across her features. "At least rich people can afford to live," she had shot back. That conversation marked the beginning of the end. From that night forward, their interactions became increasingly transactional. Celeste would check on his medications with the efficiency of a nurse, discuss his medical appointments like a secretary, and handle their shared expenses with the detachment of an accountant. The warmth that had defined their relationship slowly drained away, replaced by a professional courtesy that felt worse than outright hostility. Marcel watched his daughter disappear behind a wall of ambition and resentment, her love buried so deep beneath layers of exhaustion and frustration that sometimes he wondered if it had ever existed at all. The apartment itself seemed to reflect their deteriorating relationship. Celeste's side became increasingly organized and sterile, expensive work clothes hung with military precision, law books arranged by subject matter, everything in its proper place. Marcel's side grew more chaotic as his illness progressed, medical supplies scattered across surfaces, pill bottles multiplying like weeds, the constant presence of machines and tubes marking the territory of the dying. They lived like polite strangers sharing space, each trapped in their own version of suffering. And somewhere in the growing distance between them, the seeds of this moment, this lottery ticket, these cruel words, this shattering of whatever was left, had been quietly taking root. The ghost of Amélie haunted every corner of their fractured relationship. Marcel's eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantelpiece, a young woman with Celeste's delicate features but softer edges, holding a 3-year-old girl who was laughing at something beyond the camera's reach. Amélie had died when Celeste was only 8, taken by the same aggressive cancer that now seemed to echo in Marcel's failing kidneys. The similarities were too painful to ignore, and both father and daughter carried the weight of that loss differently. For Marcel, Amélie's death had been a call to love more fiercely while time remained. For Celeste, it had become a lesson in the cruelty of caring too much. "Do you remember what Maman used to say about money?" Marcel asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a prayer. Celeste's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn away from the window. "She used to say that money was like water, it only mattered when you didn't have enough, but it could never make you less thirsty for the things that really mattered." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of memory. Amélie had worked as a seamstress, her fingers always stained with fabric dye, her lap always available for a tired child or worried husband. Celeste's reflection in the window wavered slightly, as if the glass itself was rejecting the person she had become. Maman died poor, she said quietly, her voice thick with an emotion she was trying to suppress. She died leaving bills we couldn't pay and debts we couldn't escape. She died because we couldn't afford the better doctors, the private treatments, the experimental therapies that might have saved her. The words came out like confessions, each one revealing the wound that had never healed. Her noble heart and generous spirit didn't pay for her funeral, Papa. You did, working yourself into the ground until your own body started failing. Marcel felt the familiar ache in his chest, not from his illness, but from the memory of those desperate years after Amelie's death. He had indeed worked double shifts, taken every overtime opportunity, sold everything of value they owned to keep their heads above water. Celeste had watched it all with the observant eyes of a child who was learning that love, no matter how pure, couldn't protect you from the harsh realities of the world. She had seen her father's strength become weakness, his devotion become desperation, his love become a burden he carried until it broke him. Your mother chose to spend her last months with us instead of in some sterile hospital room, Marcel said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. She chose to read you bedtime stories instead of sleeping off the pain medication. She chose to teach you how to braid your hair and cook her mother's recipes instead of giving up and letting the cancer win early. The medical equipment around him hummed and beeped, creating a mechanical lullaby that seemed to mock the organic warmth of those memories. Those choices had value that no lottery ticket could ever match. But Celeste turned around now, her eyes blazing with a pain that had been festering for 15 years. And where did those beautiful choices leave us, Papa? Where did all that love and sacrifice and noble suffering get us? She gestured around the small apartment, at the medical bills, at the broken-down furniture and peeling wallpaper. Maman died anyway. You got sick anyway. I had to fight for everything anyway. Her love didn't protect me from being the poor kid at school. Her sacrifices didn't keep me from working 3 jobs to pay for university. Her beautiful memory didn't make the bill collectors any kinder when you couldn't work anymore. The photograph of Amelie seemed to watch them both, her smile captured in a moment when the future still held promise instead of pain. Marcel realized that they weren't just fighting about lottery money or medical treatments or the cost of survival. They were fighting about the meaning of love itself. Whether it was worth the price it demanded, whether sacrifice was noble or foolish, whether caring for someone could be both the most beautiful and most destructive thing a person could do. In the silence that followed Celeste's outburst, both father and daughter grappled with the same terrible question: had Amelie's love saved them or doomed them? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Marcel could pinpoint the exact moment when his daughter had started to change, when the softness in her eyes had begun to harden into something unrecognizable. It was 6 months after she joined Du Bois and Associates, when she came home carrying a designer briefcase that cost more than their monthly rent. It's an investment, she had explained, seeing his shocked expression. Image matters in this business. Clients need to see success before they'll trust you with their money. The logic was sound, but something in her tone had shifted, a coldness that reminded him uncomfortably of the wealthy clients she now served. Maître Dubois himself was a man who collected expensive things, art, cars, young lawyers with potential. Celeste had caught his attention not just for her legal mind, but for her hunger, her willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. She began staying late not just to finish work, but to observe how the partners conducted themselves, how they dressed, how they spoke, how they viewed the world through the lens of profit and power. The office became her second home, then her primary residence, with the apartment where Marcel waited feeling more like an obligation she visited out of duty rather than love. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Celeste had started saying whenever Marcel expressed concern about her longer hours or shorter temper. The phrase became her shield against any criticism, any request for her time or attention. At the firm, she was surrounded by people who measured worth in billable hours and client acquisitions, who spoke of family obligations as career limitations, who had learned to compartmentalize their emotions like files in a cabinet. The young woman who once cried during sentimental movies began to view sentiment itself as weakness. The breaking point had come during a partner meeting where Maitre Dubois had praised her work but questioned her commitment. "Exceptional lawyers make exceptional sacrifices," he had said, his cold eyes studying her like a specimen under glass. "Your work is exemplary, but I sense divided loyalties. The law demands your complete attention, not whatever remains after you've attended to personal matters." The phrase, personal matters, had been delivered with subtle disdain, making it clear that Marcel's illness was seen as a professional handicap rather than a family crisis. That night, Celeste had come home and looked at her father with new eyes, not as the man who had raised her and loved her unconditionally, but as an obstacle to her professional advancement. The guilt of that recognition had made her even angrier, because she knew it was true. Every medical emergency that pulled her from work, every hospital visit that made her miss client meetings, every moment of emotional exhaustion that affected her performance was costing her opportunities she had worked too hard to earn. The resentment grew like a cancer of its own, eating away at the bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Marcel watched this transformation with the helpless pain of a parent witnessing their child's destruction. He saw how she had learned to hide her emotions behind professional competence, how she had trained herself to view relationships as transactions, how she had convinced herself that independence was more valuable than connection. The lottery ticket in her purse represented more than money. It was her final declaration of freedom from the burden of loving someone whose needs threatened her carefully constructed success. And the cruelest irony was that in trying to avoid becoming like him, sacrificing everything for someone else's welfare, she had become something far worse, someone who could calculate the value of love and find it lacking. 3 weeks before the lottery drawing, Marcel had collapsed in the bathroom at 2:47 a.m. The crash of his body hitting the tile floor echoed through the apartment like a gunshot, followed by the terrible silence of a man too weak to call for help. Celeste had found him 20 minutes later, his skin gray and cold, his breathing shallow and irregular. The ambulance ride to Hospital Edouard Herriot had been a blur of sirens and medical jargon, but one moment remained crystal clear in both their memories, when the paramedic had asked if she was his next of kin, and she had hesitated before answering yes. The hospital's fluorescent lights had stripped away all pretense, revealing the stark reality of Marcel's condition. Dar. Moreau, a kind man with tired eyes, had delivered the news with gentle precision. Marcel's kidneys were failing faster than expected, and without immediate surgery followed by ongoing dialysis, he had perhaps 6 months to live. The cost of treatment would be substantial, more than Celeste's salary could cover, more than their insurance would approve, more than their combined resources could handle. "There are programs for situations like this," the doctor had said carefully, "but they require extensive paperwork and family commitment." Celeste had stood in that sterile hallway, listening to the cost of keeping her father alive, and felt something inside her freeze. The numbers Dr. Moreau quoted, 30,000 euros for the surgery, 1,500 euros monthly for dialysis, additional costs for medications and complications, weren't just financial obligations. They were chains that would bind her to this hospital, to this disease, to this dying man who had already consumed so much of her life. She could feel her carefully planned future crumbling with each digit the doctor pronounced. "I need time to think," she had told Dr. Moreau, the words coming out harder than she intended. Marcel, barely conscious on the hospital bed, had opened his eyes at the sound of her voice. The look he gave her in that moment would haunt both of them. Not accusation or disappointment, but understanding. He knew what she was thinking because he had thought the same thoughts when Amelie was dying, when the bills were mounting and the future looked impossibly dark. The only difference was that he had chosen love over logic, sacrifice over self-preservation. And that choice had brought them to this moment. The ride home from the hospital had been silent except for the taxi's engine and the occasional beep from Marcel's portable oxygen monitor. Celeste had helped him to bed with mechanical efficiency, checked his medications with professional thoroughness, and then sat in her own room staring at the ceiling until dawn. She had 3 weeks to find a solution, 3 weeks to secure the funding, 3 weeks to decide whether her father's life was worth derailing her own. The lottery ticket she bought the next day hadn't been about hope or luck, it had been about desperation disguised as denial. When she won, when those numbers aligned like stars in a cruel constellation, the first emotion wasn't joy but relief. Finally, the universe had provided an escape route. The money could save Marcel's life, but it could also save hers, from obligation, from guilt, from the endless cycle of sacrifice that had defined their family for too long. Standing in that doorway with the winning ticket in her hand, Celeste had made her choice. And Marcel, looking at his daughter's face as she spoke those devastating words, realized that he had raised someone who had learned his lessons too well. She would not let love destroy her the way it had destroyed him. Even if that meant letting him die. The lottery ticket felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Celeste sat at her small kitchen table, the winning numbers spread before her like evidence in a case she was trying to solve. 7, 14, 23, 31, 42, and 49, 6 numbers that had transformed her from a struggling lawyer into one of the wealthiest people in France. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had spent years calculating billable hours down to the minute, yet these numbers had appeared in her life with no effort at all. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight, each second marking time she would never have to worry about money again. Marcel's breathing apparatus provided a steady rhythm from the next room, a mechanical heartbeat that reminded her of the choice she had made. The medical bills scattered across the counter seemed suddenly insignificant, numbers on paper that her new fortune could erase with a single bank transfer. But erasing the debt wouldn't erase the resentment, wouldn't undo the years of watching her dreams subordinated to his needs, wouldn't restore the childhood she had lost to his illness and his grief. The money could solve everything except the fundamental question of whether she wanted to. She pulled out her laptop and began researching what 47 million euros could actually accomplish. A house in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, with a view of the Trocadero. An apartment in Manhattan. A villa in Tuscany. Law school paid for twice over. A career bought and paid for instead of clawed and fought for. Travel to places she had only seen in movies. Freedom from every form of dependence, from every obligation that had defined her life. The computer screen glowed in the darkness, showing her a future that was finally, completely, her own. But as she scrolled through real estate listings and luxury travel packages, another calculation began forming in her mind, the lawyer's habit of examining both sides of every argument. Marcel's treatments would cost roughly 200,000 euros over 5 years. A comfortable apartment near the hospital would be another 300,000. Home care, medications, quality of life improvements, perhaps €1 million total. Against 47 million, it was a rounding error. Mathematically, saving her father's life would barely register in her new fortune. The cruel mathematics of the situation made her decision seem even more heartless. She wasn't denying him the money because she couldn't afford it, but because she chose not to. The distinction felt important somehow, like the difference between manslaughter and murder in criminal law. Intent mattered. Choice mattered. And she was choosing herself, not out of necessity but out of will. The laptop screen reflected her face back at her, tired, successful, alone, and for a moment she barely recognized the woman staring back. A soft sound from Marcel's room made her look up. Was he awake? Had he heard her typing, calculating, planning a future that didn't include him? The thought filled her with a mixture of guilt and defiance. She had every right to this money, every right to the life it could provide. She had earned it through years of sacrifice, through the loss of her mother, through the burden of caring for a dying man when she should have been living her own life. The lottery ticket was her ticket out of a story that had been written in obligation and duty. For the first time in her adult life, she was going to write her own ending. The antiseptic smell of Hôpital Édouard Herriot clung to Celeste's clothes like a guilty conscience. She had driven Marcel there for his weekly dialysis appointment, a routine that had become as predictable as sunrise, the careful transfer from wheelchair to car, the folding of the portable oxygen tank, the silent ride through Lyon's morning traffic. The hospital's oncology wing was where her mother had died 15 years ago, and walking these halls always felt like traveling through time. The same beige walls, the same uncomfortable plastic chairs, the same sense of hope slowly draining away like water through cracked pipes. Marcel's dialysis sessions took 4 hours, 4 hours where Celeste typically worked on her laptop in the family waiting area, billing clients for time spent in this temple of human frailty. But today, with the lottery ticket secure in her purse, she found herself wandering the corridors instead. The pediatric ward was on the 3rd floor, and she paused outside the playroom window, watching children with bald heads and bright eyes building towers from blocks. Their laughter carried through the glass, a sound so pure it seemed impossible in this place of suffering. These children would grow up the way she had, learning too early that love was often measured in medical bills and sacrifice. Dar. Moreau found her there, standing motionless as she watched a little girl carefully place a red block on top of a precarious tower. Mademoiselle Dubois, he said gently, using the professional name she had adopted at the firm. Your father is responding well to today's treatment. His spirit seemed better. The doctor's eyes were kind but tired, the eyes of a man who had delivered too much bad news to too many families. Has there been any progress on the funding question? The sooner we can schedule the surgery, the better his chances. Celeste's hand instinctively moved to her purse, feeling the crisp edge of the lottery ticket through the leather. I'm still exploring options, she lied, the words coming easily after years of legal training in careful ambiguity. Dr. Moreau nodded, but she could see the concern in his expression. He had worked with enough families to recognize the signs. The gradual shift from determination to resignation, the slow acceptance that some battles couldn't be won. There's no shame in acknowledging limitations, he said carefully. Your father understands the situation. He's made peace with it. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the dialysis center. A machine was beeping urgently, and nurses were moving with the controlled speed that meant emergency. Celeste felt her heart stop as she and Dr. Moreau rushed toward the sound, but it wasn't Marcel's machine, it was the patient next to him, an elderly woman whose family surrounded her bed with expressions of helpless terror. Marcel was watching the scene with the detached interest of someone who had accepted his own mortality, his eyes meeting Celeste's through the glass partition with something that looked almost like relief. When the crisis passed and the other patient had been stabilized, Celeste sat beside Marcel's chair as the machine continued its rhythmic work of cleaning his blood. Papa, she said quietly, Dr. Moreau says you've made peace with the situation. Marcel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I've had a good life, ma petite. I raised a brilliant daughter, I loved a wonderful woman, I did work that mattered. Not everyone gets so much. His words were meant to comfort her, to release her from obligation, but they felt like tiny knives cutting away at the foundations of everything she thought she knew about herself. But you could have more time, she said, testing the waters of possibility. If the funding could be found, if the surgery happened, you could have years. Marcel smiled, the same gentle smile that had comforted her through childhood nightmares and adolescent heartbreaks. Time for what, Sherry? To watch you sacrifice your future for my past. To see you become bitter and resentful like I did after your mother died. To burden you with the choice between living your life and saving mine. His questions hung in the air like accusations, each one revealing how clearly he understood the impossible position she was in. And in that moment, Celeste realized that keeping the lottery money might not be cruelty, it might be the greatest gift she could give him. Maître Dubois's office was a shrine to success, every surface polished to reflect his image back at him from multiple angles. Leather-bound law books lined shelves that had never seen dust, and crystal awards caught the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Lyon's legal district. Celeste sat in the chair across from his massive mahogany desk, acutely aware that this meeting would determine her future. Or at least the future she had before 6 numbers changed everything. The lottery ticket remained her secret, locked away like evidence that could destroy or liberate her depending on how she chose to use it. Your performance has been exceptional, Dubois began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man accustomed to controlling conversations. Your client acquisition rate is the highest among junior associates, your billable hours exceed targets, and your research skills are impeccable. He paused, allowing the praise to register before delivering what Celeste already sensed was coming. However, there are concerns about your long-term commitment to the firm. The words hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, sharp and dangerous and ready to fall. Celeste had prepared for this conversation, but the lottery win had changed her calculations entirely. A week ago, she would have begged for more time, promised to manage her personal obligations better, possibly even suggested boarding arrangements for Marcel that would free her schedule completely. Now, with 47 million euros in her metaphorical pocket, she found herself studying Dubois with detached curiosity rather than desperate need. His tan was expensive, his suit was Italian, his watch cost more than most people's cars. But he still had to work, still had to please clients, still had to justify his existence through productive hours. She no longer needed any of it. The partnership track requires absolute dedication, Dubois continued, mistaking her silence for attention rather than evaluation. We've had 3 instances in the past month where family obligations have interfered with client service. The Moreau account specifically requested that you be removed from their case after you missed a crucial meeting for a medical appointment. His fingers drummed against the desk surface, a gesture that would have terrified her a week ago. Now it seemed merely petulant. I need to know that you're prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. The irony was almost funny. Dubois was demanding that she sacrifice her father for her career at the exact moment when her career had become financially irrelevant. But more than that, he was revealing the fundamental coldness of the world she had been so desperate to join. Success in this environment required the systematic elimination of inconvenient love, the careful calculation of human worth against professional advancement. She had been willing to make that calculation, had even made it, but now she could see the machine from the outside rather than grinding away inside it. I've been thinking about sacrifice, Celeste said finally, her voice steady in a way that surprised them both. About what we give up to get what we want, and whether what we want is worth what we give up. Dubois frowned, clearly expecting either desperate compliance or grateful resignation. My father is dying, she continued, and you're asking me to choose between saving him and impressing clients who will forget my name within a year of my departure." The words came out with crystalline clarity, each one carefully chosen for maximum impact. Du Bois leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from authority to uncertainty. This was not the conversation he had planned. "Celeste, I understand this is difficult, but business requires." She cut him off with a raised hand, a gesture she had learned from watching him dismiss countless subordinates. "Business requires profit, Maître Du Bois. Everything else is preference." The lottery ticket in her purse felt like a weapon she could deploy at any moment, but she wasn't ready to show her hand yet. Let him think she was still trapped in his carefully constructed web of ambition and obligation. Let him believe he still held power over her future. The revelation would be so much sweeter when it came. Behind their apartment building, hidden between two larger structures, lay a small courtyard that most residents ignored. Marcel had discovered it when Celeste was 10, during one of his restless walks after Amélie's death. It had become their secret place, a patch of neglected garden where wild roses grew through chain-link fencing and cats sunned themselves on warm stones. Today, as evening painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Marcel sat in his wheelchair while Celeste stood nearby, both of them avoiding the conversation they needed to have. The lottery ticket remained unmentioned between them, a presence as real as the gathering darkness. "Do you remember when you were 12 and thought you could solve poverty by giving away all our money?" Marcel asked, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent since her announcement about the lottery. Celeste felt herself smile despite everything, a genuine expression that surprised them both. She had indeed emptied her savings account, all 43 euros of it, and handed the money to a homeless woman outside the cathedral. "You were so angry with me for stopping you from giving away our grocery money too," Marcel continued. "You said I didn't understand that sharing was more important than eating." The memory felt like it belonged to different people, characters in a story about a father and daughter who still believed in each other's essential goodness. "I thought I could fix everything back then," Celeste admitted, her professional armor cracking slightly in this place that held only childhood memories. "I thought if everyone just shared what they had, nobody would have to suffer." The wild roses had bloomed early this year, their pink petals already beginning to fall like tiny tears onto the stone path. "I didn't understand that sharing required sacrifice, and that sacrifice required strength most people don't have." Marcel watched his daughter's face as she spoke, seeing flashes of the idealistic child she had once been. "You still want to fix things," he observed gently. "You've just learned to fix them for yourself instead of everyone else." The words weren't accusation or criticism, just recognition of how pain could reshape a person's priorities. A cat approached them cautiously, recognizing Marcel from his frequent visits to this forgotten garden. The little girl who wanted to solve poverty grew up to become a lawyer who helps rich people get richer. "That's not failure, Sherry. That's adaptation." "But what if I don't want to adapt anymore?" The question escaped before Celeste could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than she had allowed herself in years. The lottery ticket in her purse represented ultimate adaptation, the ability to remove herself entirely from the compromises and calculations that had defined her adult life. But sitting in this garden with her dying father, she felt the weight of another possibility. What if I wanted to be 12 again, just for a moment? What if I wanted to believe that sharing was more important than surviving? Marcel reached for her hand, his fingers cold but steady. "The money you won, it's not really about the money, is it?" His question was so gentle it barely disturbed the evening air, but it hit Celeste like a physical blow. He knew. Of course he knew. She had never been able to hide anything from him, not her first broken heart or her graduation fears or the slow death of her compassion under the weight of professional success. "You're not keeping it because you don't love me," he continued. "You're keeping it because you're afraid that loving me will destroy you the way loving your mother destroyed me." The garden fell silent except for the distant sounds of the city beyond their hidden sanctuary. Celeste felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years building behind her eyes. The truth was more complicated than greed or selfishness or even justified self-preservation. She was terrified of becoming her father, broken, depleted, used up by the demands of loving someone who couldn't love themselves back to health. But she was equally terrified of becoming someone who could calculate the value of love and find it insufficient. In this moment of recognition, she realized that the lottery ticket wasn't just about money or freedom or even survival. It was about the kind of person she wanted to be when everything else was stripped away. The bank manager's office smelled like leather and authority, a carefully crafted environment designed to make large sums of money feel natural and comfortable. Monsieur Bertrand had handled wealthy clients before, but 47 million euros still commanded his personal attention and most obsequious smile. Celeste sat across from his polished desk, listening to him explain investment strategies and tax implications with the enthusiasm of a man who would earn substantial fees from her newfound wealth. The lottery ticket had been verified, the funds were being processed, and within 48 hours she would officially be one of the richest people in France. "Of course, with a sum this large, we recommend diversification," Bertrand was saying, his fingers dancing across a calculator as he outlined portfolios and risk assessments. "Government bonds for stability, international markets for growth, perhaps some property investments for tangible assets." His words washed over Celeste like background noise as she stared out the window at the busy street below. People hurried past carrying their small worries and modest dreams, unaware that someone in this building had just won enough money to solve most of their problems combined. The irony felt crushing. "Mademoiselle Dubois." Bertrand's voice called her back to the present. "I was asking about your family situation. For estate planning purposes, of course. Any dependents we should consider in the portfolio structure?" The question was routine financial planning, but it felt like a knife turning in an already open wound. Marcel's face flashed through her mind, the hope in his eyes when she had agreed to bring him to dialysis, the resignation when she explained that the experimental treatments were too expensive, the quiet dignity with which he had accepted his approaching death. "No dependence," she heard herself say, the lie sliding out with practiced ease. "I'm entirely independent." Bertrand nodded and made a note in his file, probably thinking how refreshing it was to work with a client who wasn't burdened by family obligations. The freedom to make purely financial decisions without emotional complications was a luxury that wealthy people often took for granted. "Excellent," he said. "That simplifies everything considerably. No need to consider long-term care provisions or medical emergency funds." The irony of his words hit her like a physical blow. Here she was, planning a financial future that specifically excluded the person who had made her capable of earning such wealth in the first place. Marcel had worked double shifts to pay for her education, had sacrificed his health to ensure her opportunities, had loved her unconditionally through every phase of her development into the woman now sitting in this office. And she was repaying that love by pretending he didn't exist, by treating their relationship like a business liability she could simply choose to close. As Bertrand continued outlining her options, the Paris apartment she could buy in cash, the vacation homes, the investment properties, the charitable foundations she might establish for tax purposes, Celeste found herself calculating different numbers. The cost of Marcel's surgery, 30,000 euros. His ongoing treatment, 1,500 euros monthly. A comfortable apartment near the hospital, €300,000. Home care to ensure his final years had dignity, another 100,000. Against €47 million, these amounts were statistical noise, rounding errors that wouldn't meaningfully impact her lifestyle or financial security. She could save her father's life with less money than she would spend on a luxury car. But saving his life wasn't really the question, was it? The question was whether she wanted to remain the kind of person who would choose to save it. Whether she wanted to be someone who honored the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment, or someone who had learned to calculate love in terms of convenience and cost. As Bertrand handed her documents to sign and keys to safety deposit boxes, Celeste realized that the lottery hadn't just given her financial freedom, it had given her the power to decide who she wanted to be when money was no longer an excuse for any choice she made. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed among the usual bills and advertisements that cluttered their mailbox. Celeste almost threw it away. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the return address showed only a street in Marseille, but something made her pause. Inside, written on paper that smelled faintly of lavender, was a letter that would shake everything she thought she knew about her family's story. Dear Celeste, it began, you don't know me, but I knew your mother. My name is Marie-Claire Rousseau, and I have something that belongs to you. Marcel was sleeping when she finished reading the letter for the third time, his breathing steady with the rhythm of afternoon medication. Marie-Claire claimed to be Amélie's childhood friend, someone who had been estranged from the family during Amélie's illness but who had kept track of them from a distance. She had seen the news about Celeste's lottery win. The media attention that came with such enormous sums was impossible to avoid, and felt compelled to reach out. The letter contained revelations that recontextualized everything Celeste understood about her parents' sacrifices and choices. Your mother had opportunities, the letter explained in careful handwriting. Before she met your father, she had been accepted to university in Paris, had received a scholarship to study literature. She was brilliant, Sherry, the kind of mind that comes along once in a generation. But she chose love instead. She chose your father, chose the life of a seamstress in Lyon, chose the path that led to you. The words blurred as Celeste read them, tears making the ink swim across the page. She never regretted that choice, but she made me promise something if anything ever happened to her. The promise was simple but devastating. If Amélie's daughter ever achieved the success that had been denied to the mother, Marie-Claire was to tell her the truth about sacrifice and love. Amélie had saved money in secret, small amounts hidden from Marcel's knowledge, intended as a safety net for Celeste's education. When the cancer came, she had insisted on using that money for experimental treatments that might give her more time with her daughter, rather than preserving it for Celeste's future. The money had been spent on 6 additional months of life, months where she taught Celeste to cook, to braid her hair, to be strong without becoming hard. She died broke but not empty, the letter continued. She died knowing she had given you the most important lesson she could, that love is not about calculation or fairness or even wisdom. It's about choosing to give yourself completely to someone else's well-being, even when, especially when, it costs you everything you thought you wanted for yourself. The words felt like a message from beyond the grave, a challenge to everything Celeste had believed about the destructive nature of sacrifice. Enclosed with the letter was a photograph Celeste had never seen, Amélie at 19, standing in front of the Sorbonne with an acceptance letter in her hand, her face glowing with the same intelligence and determination that Celeste recognized in her own mirror. On the back, in her mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "Some dreams are worth keeping, others are worth giving away. The wisdom is knowing which is which." As Celeste held the photograph, she realized that her lottery win wasn't just about financial freedom, it was about discovering whether she had inherited her mother's wisdom along with her intelligence, whether she could recognize which dreams were worth keeping and which were worth giving away. Sleep eluded Celeste as she lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still formed constellations she had mapped out at age 8. The lottery ticket sat on her nightstand like a talisman of possibility, while Marie Claire's letter rested beside it like a judgment from the past. Through the thin walls, she could hear Marcel's labored breathing and the mechanical whisper of his oxygen machine, sounds that had become the soundtrack to her adult life. Tomorrow, she would have to make a decision that would define not just her future, but the person she would become. The apartment felt different in the darkness, smaller somehow, as if the weight of her choice was pressing down on the walls themselves. She thought about the child she had been, the one who wanted to solve poverty with pocket change and believed that love could fix anything. That child had grown up to become someone who could calculate the exact cost of keeping a parent alive and find reasons to consider it too expensive. The transformation felt like a betrayal of everything pure she had once believed about herself and the world. At 3 a.m., she crept to Marcel's room and stood in the doorway, watching him sleep. His face looked peaceful in the dim light from the medical equipment, younger somehow, more like the strong father she remembered from childhood than the broken man he had become. His hands rested on the blanket, those same hands that had braided her hair and helped with homework and worked themselves raw to pay for her dreams. The oxygen tube under his nose made a soft hissing sound, a constant reminder of how fragile the boundary between life and death had become. "Papa?" she whispered, not sure if she wanted him to wake up or remain in whatever dreams offered him escape from their impossible situation. But his eyes opened immediately, alert in the way of someone who had grown accustomed to medical emergencies and middle-of-the-night crises. "Ma petite," he said softly, his voice hoarse but warm. "What troubles you at this hour?" The question was so gentle, so purely concerned with her well-being despite his own suffering, that it nearly broke her resolve entirely. "I can't sleep," she admitted, moving closer to sit on the edge of his bed. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight, and Marcel shifted to make room, a gesture so automatic and loving that it spoke to decades of shared comfort. "I keep thinking about choices, about the things we do for the people we love, about whether sacrifice is noble or just." "Stupid." The words tumbled out in a whisper, confession and question combined. Marcel studied her face in the dim light, seeing something there that made him reach for her hand. "You're thinking about your mother's letter," he said, and Celeste's sharp intake of breath confirmed what he already suspected. "Marie Claire called me this afternoon while you were at the bank. She wanted my permission before reaching out to you." His fingers were cool against hers, but his grip was steady. "I told her the truth was yours to know, whatever the consequences." The revelation that he had known about the letter all along, that he had chosen to let her discover these truths about their family, felt like another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "Did you know?" she asked. "About Maman's scholarship, about the money she spent on treatments instead of saving it for me?" Marcel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I tried to stop her," he admitted. "I told her we would find another way, that her dreams were important too. But she was convinced that 6 more months with you was worth more than any degree or career she might have had." "And now you're asking me to make the same choice," Celeste said, the words heavy with understanding. "To give up my dreams, my future, my freedom for a few more months with you." But Marcel shook his head, surprising her with the firmness of his response. "No, chérie. I'm asking you to choose what kind of person you want to be when everything else is stripped away. Your mother chose love over opportunity because that was who she was at her core. But you are not your mother, and this is not her choice to make. The mechanical sounds of the medical equipment provided a rhythm to their conversation, measuring time in heartbeats and breaths and moments of impossible clarity. The lottery money, it's not really about saving my life, is it? Marcel continued, his voice growing stronger despite the late hour. It's about whether you can live with the person you become if you don't try. Whether you can look in the mirror 20 years from now and recognize the woman staring back at you. Celeste felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that she had spent years trying to keep closed. The child who had wanted to solve poverty was still there, buried beneath layers of professional competence and protective cynicism, but still breathing, still hoping, still believing that love might be worth the price it demanded. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered, voicing the fear that had driven every decision since her mother's death. "What if trying to save you destroys me the way losing Maman destroyed you?" Marcel smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in months. "Then you'll be destroyed by love instead of destroyed by its absence," he said simply. "And when you're my age, looking back at the choices that defined your life, you'll know you chose to be someone who tried to save the people she loved, even when it was impossible, even when it was stupid, even when it cost everything you thought you wanted for yourself." The words hung in the darkness between them like a bridge spanning the chasm of their recent estrangement. And for the first time since the lottery numbers had appeared on her ticket, Celeste began to understand that the real prize wasn't the money, it was the chance to discover who she really was when faced with an impossible choice. Dawn broke over Lyon like a gentle interrogation, soft light filtering through the apartment's thin curtains to illuminate the detritus of their fractured life. Medical bills scattered across surfaces, pill bottles standing guard like sentries, the lottery ticket still resting on Celeste's nightstand like evidence waiting for judgment. She had dozed fitfully after her conversation with Marcel, waking every few minutes to the sound of his breathing or the mechanical whisper of oxygen flowing through plastic tubes. Now, as morning painted their familiar surroundings in gold and shadow, she felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a mantle she could no longer avoid wearing. The bank would call today to confirm the final transfer of funds. Maître Dubois expected her decision about partnership by noon. Dr. Moreau needed to know about surgery scheduling by the end of the week. The machinery of choice had been set in motion, and every hour of delay made the consequences more severe. Celeste stood in the kitchen making coffee with hands that trembled despite her attempts at composure, aware that this mundane morning ritual might be one of the last they shared. The apartment felt suspended in time, caught between the past they had lived together and the futures they might or might not share. Marcel appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but without assistance, his portable oxygen tank trailing behind him like a faithful pet. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed, accepting the cup of coffee she offered with hands that were steadier than hers. "Big decisions will do that to a person." His tone was conversational, almost casual, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the fundamental question of whether their relationship would survive the morning. The normalcy of the moment felt surreal against the backdrop of everything unsaid between them. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Celeste began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the transformation that had occurred in the dark hours before dawn. "About the kind of person I want to be, about whether I can live with my choices." She sat across from him at the small kitchen table where they had shared thousands of meals, where she had done homework while he graded papers, where they had planned her future with the naive confidence of people who believed love was enough to overcome any obstacle. "I think I've been asking the wrong questions." Marcel waited, his eyes steady and patient, giving her the space to find her words. The morning light caught the silver in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes. Evidence of the years he had spent worrying about her, sacrificing for her, loving her with the fierce dedication that had both shaped and scarred them both. "I've been asking whether I can afford to save you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. Whether I can survive the cost, whether it's fair to me, whether I deserve the freedom this money represents. But those aren't the right questions. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of recognition and the possibility of redemption. Celeste reached across the table and took her father's hands in hers, feeling the calluses from decades of work, the tremor of illness, the undeniable reality of his mortality. "The right question," she said, her words coming out clear and certain for the first time in months, "is whether I can afford not to try. Whether the person I become by choosing money over you is someone I can live with for the next 50 years. Marcel's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "And what's your answer, ma petite?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. The lottery ticket lay between them on the table, 47 million euros in potential that could buy freedom or forgiveness, independence or connection, a future without obligation or a present filled with purpose. "My answer," Celeste said, picking up the ticket and feeling its weight differently now, "is that some things are worth more than money. And you, Papa, are worth everything I have to give." The decision, once made, felt not like sacrifice but like coming home to herself. To the child who had wanted to solve poverty with pocket change, to the daughter who had inherited her mother's wisdom along with her beauty, to the woman who could choose love even when it cost everything she thought she wanted. 3 months later, the private room at Hôpital Édouard Herriot felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. Marcel lay propped against pristine white pillows, his color better than Celeste had seen in years, the successful kidney transplant having given him not just more time but genuine hope for the future. The experimental surgery had been expensive, nearly everything Celeste had initially planned to spend on her new life, but watching her father read a book without the constant background noise of dialysis machines made every euro feel like the best investment she had ever made. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been professionally cleaned, illuminating a room filled with flowers from friends and colleagues who had watched their relationship transform from bitter estrangement to something deeper than it had ever been before. Dr. Moreau entered with the kind of smile that doctors reserve for genuinely good news. "The latest tests are remarkable," he announced, settling into the visitor's chair with the relaxed posture of a man delivering a miracle. "Kidney function is at 90% of normal range, rejection markers are virtually undetectable, and the donor compatibility was better than we dared hope." Marcel squeezed Celeste's hand as the doctor spoke, both of them remembering the dark days when such optimism had seemed impossible. "With proper care and medication, we're looking at 20 to 25 years of normal life expectancy. Maybe more." Celeste felt tears she no longer tried to hide slip down her cheeks. 25 years. Time for grandchildren she might never have, for conversations about books and politics and the weather, for ordinary moments that had seemed precious only when their number appeared finite. The lottery money was nearly gone: surgery, rehabilitation, a comfortable apartment near the hospital, modifications for accessibility, a trust fund for ongoing medical care. But sitting in this sunny room watching her father plan his recovery, she felt wealthier than any bank balance could have made her. She had bought something money couldn't typically purchase: the chance to love someone completely without counting the cost. "There's something else," Marcel said once Dr. Moreau had left to continue his rounds. From his bedside table, he pulled out a legal document that made Celeste's heart skip. "I've been working with a lawyer. Not one of your fancy colleagues, but someone who understands families like ours." The papers showed the establishment of a scholarship fund in Amélie's name, seeded with the remainder of the lottery winnings, designed to help children who had lost parents afford university education. "Your mother's dream," he explained, "extended to children who need the same chances she gave up to be with us." The scholarship would ensure that Amelie's sacrifice rippled forward through generations, that other brilliant children wouldn't have to choose between education and family loyalty the way Marcel and Celeste had been forced to. It would transform private pain into public good, turning the lottery money into something more meaningful than luxury or even extended life. But Papa, Celeste protested, that money was meant to secure your future, to ensure you never have to worry about medical bills or care. Marcel shook his head, his eyes bright with the kind of purpose she hadn't seen since her childhood. Ma petite, he said, his voice strong despite everything they had been through, I've learned something these past months. The most expensive things in life, love, forgiveness, family, meaning, can't be bought with lottery winnings. But they can be earned by choosing to give rather than to keep, to trust rather than to protect, to love rather than to survive. He gestured toward the window where lions spread out beneath them, full of families facing their own impossible choices. We have enough. We have each other. We have time we thought we'd lost. Everything else is just details. Celeste understood then that the real lottery hadn't been the numbers on a ticket, but the chance to discover who she was when everything else was stripped away. She had won something far more valuable than 47 million euros, she had won herself back. The child who wanted to solve poverty had grown up to become a woman who could choose love over logic, sacrifice over safety, connection over comfort. And in making that choice, she had found the kind of wealth that could never be calculated in bank accounts or investment portfolios, the wealth of living as someone she could respect, someone her mother would have been proud of, someone worthy of the love that had shaped her from the very beginning. 6 months after the transplant, Celeste walked through the gleaming lobby of Dubois and Associates with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed anything the firm could offer. Her resignation letter was tucked neatly in a folder, along with case files she had meticulously prepared for transition to other attorneys. The marble floors that had once intimidated her now felt merely decorative, the hushed reverence of expensive success seeming almost quaint compared to the robust chaos of the rehabilitation center where she now spent her mornings helping Marcel regain his strength. Maître Dubois received her in his office with the strained courtesy of a man who had never quite recovered from her earlier display of independence. The partnership offer still stood, he assured her, though his tone suggested it was more obligation than enthusiasm. Your work on the Moreau account was exemplary, he said, reviewing her file with professional detachment. Despite your personal distractions, your billable hours remained competitive. The phrase, personal distractions hung in the air like an insult wrapped in legal politeness, referring to the weeks she had spent coordinating Marcel's surgery and recovery. About those personal distractions, Celeste replied, settling into her chair with none of the desperate eagerness that had once characterized her meetings in this office. I'm resigning, effective immediately. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock across Dubois's carefully composed features. He had expected negotiation, perhaps a request for reduced hours or extended leave, but not complete departure from the career path she had fought so hard to establish. The resignation letter made a soft sound as it slid across his polished desk. This is highly irregular, Dubois sputtered, his authority suddenly feeling fragile in the face of someone who clearly didn't need his approval. Your career prospects, your future in law, the investment this firm has made in your development. The list of objections felt hollow to Celeste, like echoes from a life she no longer recognized as her own. I understand the appeal of temporary charity work, he continued, but you're throwing away everything you've worked to achieve. Celeste smiled, remembering the woman who had sat in this same chair months earlier, desperate for validation from a man whose approval now seemed irrelevant. I'm not throwing anything away, Maître Dubois. I'm choosing something different. She stood, feeling the weight of liberation in her bones. I'm opening a legal aid clinic for families dealing with medical crises. Pro bono work, mostly, funded by private donations and grants. The kind of law that actually helps people instead of just helping them get richer. The silence that followed her announcement stretched uncomfortably as Du Bois processed the implications. She was walking away from guaranteed wealth, from social status, from everything their profession valued most highly. "That's noble," he said finally, the word sounding like a diagnosis of mental illness. "But nobility doesn't pay medical bills or fund retirement accounts." What happens when your idealism meets financial reality? His question revealed more about his worldview than her decision, the assumption that money was the ultimate measure of success, that helping people was a luxury only the independently wealthy could afford. "My father needed expensive surgery to save his life," Celeste replied, gathering her personal items from the office shelves. "I won the lottery and used the money to pay for his treatment. But the real lottery wasn't the money. It was discovering that I could afford to be the kind of person who would make that choice." She paused at the door, looking back at the office that had once represented everything she thought she wanted. Some investments pay dividends in dollars. Others pay dividends in being able to sleep at night. I prefer the second kind. As she walked out of Du Bois and Associates for the last time, Celeste felt not the sting of career suicide, but the joy of professional rebirth. The chance to use her legal skills in service of something larger than personal advancement or corporate profit. The storefront on Rue de la République had been empty for 2 years, its windows dusty and neglected, a casualty of Lyon's changing economic landscape. But Celeste saw possibility in its abandoned state. High ceilings that could accommodate multiple consultation areas, large windows that would flood the space with natural light, a location accessible to the families who needed legal help but couldn't afford the marble lobbies of firms like Du Bois and Associates. The lease was surprisingly affordable, the renovation costs modest, and within 3 months of leaving her corporate position, she was hanging a simple wooden sign that read Rousseau Legal Aid Clinic, in honor of her mother's maiden name. Marcel insisted on attending the clinic's opening ceremony despite his ongoing recovery, arriving in his wheelchair with oxygen tank and the stubborn pride of a father watching his daughter build something meaningful. The space filled gradually with an unlikely mixture of people. Former clients who had followed Celeste from her corporate practice, social workers from the hospital, other attorneys curious about her dramatic career change, and families who had heard about free legal services through the network of whispered recommendations that spread through Lyon's struggling neighborhoods. The contrast with her previous professional environment was stark and somehow beautiful. "We're not trying to replace high-end legal services," Celeste explained to the gathered crowd, standing behind a desk that had cost €50 at a flea market instead of 5,000 at an exclusive furniture store. "We're trying to provide the kind of legal support that everyone deserves but most people can't afford. Help with medical debt negotiations, insurance claim appeals, disability applications, estate planning for families with limited resources." The work would be challenging and certainly not financially rewarding in traditional terms, but sitting in that sun-filled space surrounded by people who genuinely needed her help, Celeste felt more professionally satisfied than she ever had billing corporate clients for services they could easily afford. The first weeks were chaotic as word spread about the clinic's services. Families arrived with bags full of medical bills, insurance forms, collection notices, and legal documents they couldn't understand. Many spoke limited French, some were elderly and confused by bureaucratic language, others were simply overwhelmed by systems designed to discourage rather than assist. Celeste found herself translating not just languages but entire ways of understanding the world. Explaining legal rights to people who had never imagined they had any, negotiating with institutions from a position of knowledge rather than desperation, using her education and training to level playing fields that had been tilted against her clients since birth. "This is what law school should have prepared us for," she told Marcel one evening as they reviewed the day's cases over dinner in their new apartment near the clinic. The space was smaller than what they could have afforded with lottery winnings, but it was comfortable and close enough to the hospital for Marcel's continuing care. Real problems affecting real people, not corporate merger strategies or tax avoidance schemes for clients who already have everything they need. Marcel nodded, watching his daughter's face animate as she described a successful appeal that had restored a widow's healthcare benefits or a negotiation that had prevented a family's bankruptcy. The transformation in Celeste was obvious to anyone who knew her well. The sharp edges of corporate ambition had softened into focused purpose, the calculating intelligence that had served wealthy clients now deployed in service of people who measured success in keeping their homes or accessing medical treatment rather than maximizing profit margins. The clinic's sliding scale fee structure meant that some clients paid nothing, others contributed what they could afford, and a few former corporate contacts made substantial donations that helped sustain the operation. It wasn't the life she had planned when she first entered law school, but it was the life that made use of everything she had learned, about sacrifice and love, about the real cost of helping people, about the difference between earning money and earning meaning. And every morning when she unlocked the clinic's door, Celeste felt the satisfaction of someone whose work aligned with their values, whose professional success could be measured in lives improved rather than dollars accumulated. 2 years after the clinic's opening, disaster struck with the cruel timing that seemed to characterize all of life's most important tests. Marcel's annual checkup revealed what Dr. Moreau called concerning developments, signs that the transplanted kidney was beginning to show stress, markers that suggested the possibility of rejection despite the apparent success of the initial surgery. The numbers were subtle, the symptoms minimal, but the implications were terrifying. Marcel might need another transplant, more experimental treatments, costs that would dwarf even the original surgery. The lottery money was long gone, spent on the first transplant and the clinic's establishment, leaving Celeste to face her father's potential second medical crisis with the limited resources of someone who had chosen meaning over money. The timing couldn't have been worse. The clinic was thriving but operating on thin margins, serving more clients than the budget could comfortably sustain, dependent on grants and donations that could disappear with economic downturns or shifting philanthropic priorities. Celeste's personal savings were negligible, the inevitable result of charging clients based on their ability to pay rather than the market value of legal services. The apartment they shared was comfortable but mortgaged, their lifestyle modest but not ascetic. They had built a sustainable life based on careful choices and reasonable expectations, but reasonable had no place in the vocabulary of advanced medical treatment. "We'll find a way," Celeste told Marcel after they received Dr. Moreau's preliminary report, but her voice lacked the confidence that had characterized her lottery-funded optimism 2 years earlier. The familiar weight of medical bills settled on their kitchen table like uninvited guests, and the apartment that had felt spacious now seemed to shrink under the pressure of impossible mathematics. The clinic's modest income couldn't support the kind of treatment Marcel might need, and returning to corporate practice would require rebuilding relationships she had deliberately abandoned in favor of work that mattered more than money. Marcel watched his daughter calculate and recalculate their options with the desperate precision of someone trying to solve an equation that had no solution. "Sherry," he said gently, reaching across the table to still her restless hands, "we knew this might happen. Dr. Moreau was clear that transplants don't last forever, that there might be complications we couldn't predict." His calmness in the face of potential death was both admirable and infuriating. The serenity of someone who had already made peace with mortality confronting the determination of someone who refused to accept it. "Perhaps it's time to discuss quality versus quantity again." But Celeste shook her head with the fierce stubbornness she had inherited from both parents, the same determination that had carried her through law school and corporate training and the establishment of her clinic. "No. We're not having that conversation. Not yet. Not when there might still be options we haven't considered." She pulled out her laptop and began researching experimental programs, clinical trials, alternative funding sources, anything that might provide a path forward that didn't require choosing between her father's life and their financial survival. The screen glowed in the darkening apartment as she worked, casting shadows that made her look like a scholar bent over ancient texts, searching for wisdom that might not exist. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. 2 years earlier, Celeste had nearly 47 million euros and had initially chosen to deny Marcel treatment out of resentment and self-protection. Now, with barely 47,000 in savings, she was prepared to sacrifice everything to keep him alive. The money had been spent not frivolously but purposefully. On his successful surgery, on the clinic that gave her life meaning, on the scholarship fund that honored Amelie's memory by helping other families avoid impossible choices. But purpose didn't pay medical bills, and meaning wouldn't fund another transplant. As midnight approached and Celeste continued her desperate research, both father and daughter faced the possibility that choosing love over money might not be enough when faced with the infinite appetite of medical crisis and the finite nature of resources built on principle rather than profit. The response to Celeste's quiet inquiries about Marcel's situation began slowly, like a stream gathering momentum as it flows downhill. Word spread through the clinic's client network. Families who had been helped with debt negotiations, insurance appeals, disability claims, and legal problems that would have destroyed them without intervention. Maria Santos, whose housing discrimination case Celeste had won pro bono, mentioned Marcel's situation to her church. Ahmed Hassan, whose workers' compensation claim had been successfully appealed, told his union friends. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a network of gratitude began to mobilize in ways that surprised everyone involved. The first check arrived in an envelope with no return address, 50 euros from someone who signed only, "a grateful client." Then came a money order for 200 euros from the church Maria had mentioned, followed by a collection from Ahmed's union local that totaled nearly 1,000 euros. Each contribution was modest, the kind of amount that working families could afford only through significant sacrifice, but the cumulative effect was overwhelming. Celeste found herself opening envelopes daily, each one containing not just money but handwritten notes expressing gratitude for services rendered, for dignity preserved, for families kept together through legal crises that had seemed insurmountable. "This is remarkable," Dr. Moreau observed when Celeste presented him with the growing fund for Marcel's treatment. "In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen this kind of community response. Usually, medical fundraising requires publicity campaigns, media attention, some kind of organized effort." He studied the collection of small donations with professional curiosity. "This seems to be entirely organic, people helping someone they've never met because they trust the person asking for help." The fund was still far short of what advanced treatment would cost, but it represented something more valuable than money. Proof that kindness could be cultivated and harvested like any other crop. Marcel insisted on meeting some of the donors, despite his increasing weakness and the complicated logistics of transporting his medical equipment. The clinic's waiting room became an informal receiving space where clients could stop by to meet the father of the lawyer who had helped them navigate their darkest moments. These encounters were brief but profound. Conversations between people who understood the weight of insurmountable problems and the grace of unexpected solutions. "Your daughter saved our home," an elderly couple told Marcel, their hands clasped in his with the intimacy of shared struggle. "Now we help save her father. This is how families work." The phrase, "this is how families work," became a recurring theme in the fundraising effort that had grown beyond anything Celeste could have imagined. Families, it turned out, weren't just units of blood relation but networks of mutual obligation created through acts of service and kindness. The clinic had created an extended family of people bound together by shared experience of legal vulnerability and professional compassion. They contributed not out of pity or charity, but out of recognition that Marcel's crisis could easily become their own, that Celeste's willingness to help them in their moments of need had created reciprocal obligations they were honored to fulfill. As the fund grew toward the threshold of possibility, not enough for the most expensive treatments, but sufficient for innovative approaches that might extend Marcel's life by years rather than months. Celeste realized that her choice to spend the lottery money on love instead of luxury had created something far more valuable than financial security. She had built a community, a network of people who measured wealth not in bank balances but in relationships sustained through mutual care and support. The fund would make Marcel's treatment possible, but the process of raising it had demonstrated something even more important. That choosing love over money had multiplied rather than diminished her resources, creating forms of wealth that could never be won in any lottery but had to be earned through years of putting other people's needs before her own calculations of cost and benefit. 5 years later, Marcel sat in the garden behind their apartment building, the same secret courtyard where he and Celeste had shared so many crucial conversations. His color was good, his breathing steady without mechanical assistance, the second transplant having been even more successful than the first. The wild roses bloomed profusely, their pink petals catching the afternoon light like confetti celebrating another ordinary miracle. At 78, he moved slowly but independently, his morning walks to the clinic serving as both exercise and an excuse to check on the work that had become the center of both their lives. The Rousseau Legal Aid Clinic had expanded into 3 locations across Lyon, serving nearly 1,000 families each year with legal services they couldn't otherwise afford. The scholarship fund in Amélie's name had grown through continued community donations to support 12 students annually, helping young people avoid the choice between education and family loyalty that had once seemed inevitable. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one man's life had evolved into a sustainable model for community-supported legal aid that was being replicated in cities across France. The lottery money was long gone, but its impact continued to multiply through lives improved and families kept together. Celeste emerged from the apartment carrying 2 cups of tea and the afternoon mail, her routine as comfortable as breathing after years of shared recovery and mutual care. At 45, she looked younger than she had during her corporate years, the stress of constant calculation replaced by the satisfaction of meaningful work and deep relationships. The clinic's sliding scale fee structure meant they lived modestly, but their needs were simple and their contentment profound. "Letter from Marie-Claire," she announced, settling into the garden chair beside Marcel's wheelchair. "The 3rd scholarship recipient from Marseille has been accepted to medical school." The letter from her mother's childhood friend had become an annual tradition, updates on the scholarship recipients and their achievements serving as a running tally of how Amélie's sacrifices continued to ripple through generations. Marie-Claire's original revelation about Amélie's choice to give up her university opportunity had become the foundation for everything that followed. The understanding that love sometimes required giving up one dream to make others possible, that sacrifice could be creative rather than merely destructive, that choosing family over individual advancement could multiply rather than diminish the good one could do in the world. "Your mother would be proud," Marcel said, a phrase that had become his standard response to news about the scholarship program or the clinic's successes. But today, as they sat in the garden where Celeste had first admitted her fear of loving too much, the words carried particular weight. Not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you chose to become when faced with an impossible decision. The lottery ticket that had once represented the choice between love and money now felt like ancient history, a catalyst for discovering values that had been there all along, waiting to be tested and proven. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtyard, illuminating the wild roses and the comfortable silence between a father and daughter who had learned to measure wealth in years shared rather than euros accumulated. The clinic would continue serving families caught in medical or legal crises, the scholarship fund would help bright young people pursue educations their parents couldn't afford, and somewhere in the city, former clients would face their own impossible choices with the knowledge that community support could make seemingly insurmountable problems manageable through collective effort and mutual care. As evening approached and the church bells of Lyon chimed the hour, Celeste realized that she had indeed won the lottery, not the obvious prize of 47 million euros, but the more valuable jackpot of discovering who she was when everything else was stripped away. She was someone who could choose love over comfort, service over success, community over independence. She was her mother's daughter and her father's child, someone capable of sacrifice without martyrdom, generosity without poverty, love without the fear that giving completely would leave nothing for herself. The lottery ticket had been just paper and ink, but the choice it had forced her to make had revealed treasures that no amount of money could purchase. The wealth of living as someone she could respect, the fortune of work that mattered, and the jackpot of love that multiplied rather than diminished when shared without calculation or reservation. In the end, she had kept the most important winnings of all, her humanity, her family, and the knowledge that some forms of wealth could only be earned by giving them away.